Hello and welcome back again to this CGSP interview. And as you can see on the screen, and maybe you're gonna see them after the montage, I'm not alone today. I'm joined with my critical minnows editor Obed Bore and also our Southeast Asia editor Edwin from Indonesia. Hello, good afternoon, good morning to you guys.
Good morning from Zimbabwe. Hello, how are you?
Hello. Good afternoon from Indonesia.
I'm really happy to have you guys today because today you're gonna have a cross-continental conversation regarding China engagement as we always do in the global south. But having you here today, it's going to allow us to kind of look into different continents on how China's engagement is happening and how it's changing, how is it evolving. And today, having you here allows our people who are following us to kind of understand, to maybe pick some lesson here and there about how China is evolving and how it should be, how they should be careful into drawing blank conclusion about across the board on how Chinese investment are evolving in the global south. So I'm not gonna make a lot of introduction. I'm gonna go straight to the point. So earlier this week, Obert, you released a very interesting piece of paper talking about the Chinese ESG standard, and the paper that you wrote the title was "A Greener Footprint: Decoding China's New ESG Standard for the Global Project," and the article covers basically some few key points regarding China new corporate sustainability disclosure standard, the basic guidelines, telling us how Chinese companies and overseas and on also back home should be behaving in terms of like the transparency in the supply chain and all of that. I'm not going to the details. Albert, you wrote that piece. Tell us what that is about.
Thank you so much, Jero, for this conversation. So indeed, I think, as you mentioned, I wrote this piece in which I was really trying to understand what is the meaning of this corporate sustainability disclosure standards or basic guidelines that were released in December last year by the Ministry of Finance, China's Ministry of Finance, together with other government agencies. So the whole of last year, they had been working on developing the corporate sustainability disclosure standards. And one might ask, what is the importance of this, ESG standard or disclosure requirement? And from where we stand and the work that we have been doing, I think we have had a lot of the environmental, social impacts of Chinese projects, both domestically and overseas across different regions. So there is a trail of a lot of impacts, both negative and positive, that have been talked about. There are so many projects, including the BRI, Belt and Road initiatives, that have also, been singled out as contributing to significant, carbon footprint. And this is where China is trying to respond to these, concerns that their companies are either polluting or impacting the environment and people in a negative way. So the development of this corporate sustainability is trying to sort of like, come up with obligations for companies that are registered in China, particularly that are registered under their top three stock exchanges: the Beijing Stock Exchange, Shenzhen Stock Exchange, and Shanghai Stock Exchange. So corporates that are, registered under these are now being expected to disclose their footprint on the environment and also how their projects are impacting people and the planet. Of course, this is a noble and bold vision that we are seeing on paper, which potentially could, have a positive impact if it's implemented. So there's a big if these guidelines are implemented. And at this stage, I must say that they are taking a cautious approach in which they are targeting large state-owned entities. And at this stage, they are more or less voluntary up to 2026. So there is a staggered approach for its implementation where we'll start to see around from 2027. They'll also expect even private companies to also report. But at this stage, they are more or less voluntary and they're targeting large companies. So I think in brief, that is what we are seeing. It's a bold move, and it's likely to have an impact. But that is if the guidelines are implemented. That is if the companies start to comply. I think there's also some transitional period in terms of allowing the companies themselves to put in place sustainability, systems that they can then use to report. Because the idea is for them to disclose how their projects, including their relationships with contractors, suppliers, etc., are contributing to the environment or social impacts, both negative and positive.
Before going to the details of the guidelines, before you taking us on the main highlights of those guidelines, I would like to go back to Edwin first. Just quick comment. Tell me, do you have the same kind of situation in Indonesia where Chinese investment, being in the mining or outside the mining, in any other kind of huge infrastructure project, are subject to criticism relating to the carbon footprint or to the way they evolve, in the way they work and the impact on the environment? Do you have the same situation in Indonesia as well?
Yeah, we have the same situation in Indonesia, most particularly from the NGOs. They are like the monitoring of the government and of the investment coming in and working in Indonesia for their compliance in the environmental regulations. And they are impacting the situation, and some led to corrections in actions and policies and in rehabilitation. Some are not being responded. But yeah, uh, the answer is yes.
But what kind of impact are we talking about here?
The impact is that when when an investment um, destroying the environment, or producing poisonous pollutants, tailing, etc., then usually the first line of complaints comes from the CSO, civil society organizations, and that gets the attention of the public, of the policymakers, and then when those issues get the attention of those policymakers, whether in government or in parliament, then the pressure will mount. The NGOs, together with the press, they will double the pressure to seek, to demand for a correction in the policies and rehabilitation in on the ground, where the tailings or poisonous pollutants or whatever occur. So that's the big picture of what's happening in Indonesia. Usually, these past few decades, perhaps, of this kind of pressure.
Before going to the highlights, Obert, I'm coming back to you. When we put in perspective Chinese investment in the BRI, big mining infrastructure, or others, compare with other investment coming from other partners, do we see any kind of difference, a particular kind of difference when it comes to environmental impact, or it's just like it's pretty much the same because of the environment? Or do you have the Chinese company are either exceptionally doing bad or exceptionally doing good, or they're just on average like many other companies are operating on the ground in Zimbabwe, for instance, or elsewhere in Africa as well?
For me, I don't see much of a difference between Chinese investments and investments, from elsewhere, be it from Europe or from America. Because when you're talking about environmental impacts of projects such as mining, or infrastructure development. Naturally, a mining or any sort of project that has to move, either beads, you're opening up a mountain through open cast mining, it is inherently destructive to the environment, irrespective of who is doing it. What then matters and what could be the difference is what the company does after it has mined or after it has, implemented that project. That is where there could be some difference, but inherently, all projects, whether it's West or it's from China, they are inherently, destructive to the environment. So for me, and also from the evidence that I see, you will find that in certain instances there might be projects where um, you know Western companies could have a rehabilitation plan where they follow through in terms of then addressing its environmental degradation, addressing that. So that is one aspect. Then the other aspect is around the governance of environmental regulation, which sometimes I would not necessarily want to blame it on China, but because I think it's a governance problem. I was speaking to one colleague from the Environmental Management Agency for Zimbabwe, and they were, admitting to the fact that some of the challenges they face is not necessarily that Chinese companies are not doing their work, but it's because they are unable to also enforce this environmental, regulation due to capacity problems, due to lack of resources, etc. So it is not necessarily a China problem. So you'll find that even some companies that could drop in names, but will not do that. They have also been implicated in projects that have been destructive to the environment, and they have not, or rehabilitated or repurposed that land after the project has ended. But it is not necessarily a China problem. Something that you find, across.
So that's now the moment that you take us to the highlights of the report that you wrote and the main key point that you kind of pointed out there, and how those key points may be different and maybe impacting the footprint of Chinese engagement in the BRI and also in the mining industry across the global south.
So one key aspect I would like to draw our attention to is Article 4 of this basic guidelines, which extends the responsibility to disclose, or disclose sustainability information across the value chain. And Article 4 uses that to say the companies listed shall have that responsibility to disclose sustainability risks, opportunities, and impacts across their different, business that they have relationships. So for that takes, for instance, if a Chinese company is mining, say within Africa or in Asia or in Latin America, and they are listed under the stock exchange, the three stock exchanges I mentioned earlier on, there is an expectation, at least on paper, that they have to also report or disclose how their suppliers or contractors are also impacting the environment. So they are going beyond not just the first tier of companies that they have a relationship with, but also include subcontractors. They are also suppliers of different material. So that is sort of.
Yes, before going further, just to clarify, it means that in under the Article 4, Chinese company must make sure that the subcontractor also are adhering to the ESG standards and regulation, not of China but international norm and standard, right?
Yes, you're quite right. You're quite right. So
That's
as you
interesting.
mentioned, international norms. So in one of the official document released by the Minister of Finance from China, they explained sort of like the background why they came up with this standard or basic guidelines for disclosure of ESG practices. Or they also make reference to the some of the international instruments that have come up, such as the EU Corporate Sustainability Disclosure, requirements. So they are also, taking a cue and learning from others in the region. So now that means Chinese companies that also have relationship with other companies that are non-Chinese, there is sort of like an extension of that responsibility to them to also be disclosing. But also there's a financial aspect that is linked to that because of what the BRI or initiative is, coming up with this smart and beautiful project that are less risk financially, in the sense that they want to invest in project that's less of a carbon footprint. So the idea is that even if a Chinese company is having business relationship with non-Chinese companies, they should also be monitoring and assessing and understanding what are the impacts of the suppliers that we have on the environment. That is as far as Article 4 goes. But this is aspirational, I must say. It is not going to be, all rose in the next few months or so. It is aspirational in the sense that they are not going to expect the company to start reporting that. Of course, they have to put in place, like in any other jurisdiction, once you have a new law, the companies will have some bit of time to sort of like adjust their operations, put in place systems for them to then start, complying. So it is aspirational in that sense.
Okay. So, Edwin, when you hear that, when you hear something like that, where there is now an obligation, a duty of having Chinese company making sure that within the supply chain, the contractor, the subcontractors are also adhering to the norms and regulation. How do you see that impacting Chinese operation in Indonesia or improving? So even to improve the operation in terms of ESG standard and impact on the environment.
So in my understanding, this China's now, if it's enforced, China will mandate companies to report their ESG practices. So to report their ESG practices means they have to implement and adhere, obey all those ESG principles. And the report must be submitted, means they will be evaluated. And if they don't get to pass that evaluation, it's on their loss. So that's also including their overseas operations. This means basically an improvement in the quality, improvement in the standards of China's end product that will hit the world's market. And I think that is good in sense of from Southeast Asia. That is good in a sense of that the products being produced by Southeast Asia will meet the standard, international standard, and will go head to head with other products, say from Western country, from Europe, or from Latin America, or from US, the same standard. Now it will only compete on efficiency, in production, etc., because they have the same standard. But for Indonesian local partner, it means more costs because they have to meet, they have
Okay.
to how to call that? They have to step up. They have to step up their game, their capital, their to meet those standards, also efforts and etc. So that will mean
So
cost.
before going further, so do you mean that in this case here, having that may lead subcontractors to increase their costs, the cost of the operation, also impacting the benefits, basically the economic operation, to meet the standard, the ESG standard and regulation? Because we also know that for many companies, ESG standard just to build the norms and to enforce them cost a lot of money. That's why many companies tend to cut on cost when it related to that. So do you see subcontractors now being impacted, and it may also impact their economic viability and the operations?
Yeah, in Indonesia, usually they do this based on a joint venture, like 55-45 or something like that. So the local shareholder will have to, how to call it, will have to step up and man up to increase their capitals, their efforts, etc., to meet these standards, so that when this their Chinese partner report to their government, they meet all the requirements. So the local partners now will have to. This is why it means that it will add an increased cost for the local partners, because they have to meet the Indonesian environmental standard, and they have to also meet the Chinese higher standard. So we don't know yet whether these standards are equal on par, or they have different standards. And whenever there is a difference, it means cost. So they have to meet those costs. Uh, but but in all, from my perspective, it's good because it will raise the standards of their products. So when they go to the world markets, nobody can challenge them that it was made by a lower environmental standard. Well, on the other side, the environment will always be, how do you call that? Will always degrade by these efforts, by these businesses. That's another question. Another important, very important question. But from this regulation, I think it's going the right way, as into improving the standard.
Yes, you since you talked about financial situation, economic situation, Obert, I'm coming back to you because when you read your piece, we see that you mentioned Article 9 where we mentioned about double materiality. I'm gonna read from your piece. You say double materiality mandating that companies disclose not only how sustainability issues affect their financial performance, but also how their activities impact the environment and society. Can you unpack and let us and tell us double materiality for the layman that we are, what does it mean and
All
how
right.
does it impact on operations? Yeah.
Thanks. You're very right. So Article 9 talks about sustainability information disclosure, complying with this principle of materiality. So in simple terms, what it means is that a company is expected to report or disclose information that is material. So when it comes to sustainability disclosures, there's information that might not be material. I'll just illustrate by an example. So a company that is in the core business, say you are in the mining of coal, or you are dealing with coal. So one of the key elements that would be defined as material is your carbon footprint, your carbon emissions, and any other emissions that are expected from that business. So that is the material. What are the material impacts that are associated with your business? So that is what is then expected of you to report or to disclose. And then double materiality. So there's a financial element and an environmental element. So how does the project or the company impact, the environment, in as far as carbon footprint is concerned, because they are a business that is in the production of the coke. You are mining coal and you are producing coke, for instance, because there are other elements that might not be material for you to disclose in your business. So it then also goes to what is focus of the business. Um, then the other aspect also linked to material is you disclose information that is what are the likely impacts in terms of severity of these impacts, the likelihood, what is the scale and the scope of both the negative and the positive. So a business cannot just, disclose the good things that they're doing. Say we have this, projects where we are trying to offset the emissions, but we also expect to see the negative aspect of how the business is contributing to emissions. So that is the double materiality aspect that is contained in Article 9.
So that double materiality, when we look into now the Article 4, Article 9, and everything that we do have there, can we say if the regulation, it's not regulation, it's a guideline, if the guideline is implemented and followed by companies, can we assume that China is moving toward a greener supply chain or a greener footprint of its operation through the BRI?
Yeah, I think in principle, and also the thinking behind these two articles, Article 4 and Article 9 that we just mentioned, is to allow companies to move to greener projects, because one of the objectives I think that is contained in Article 2 of the guidelines. One of the objectives is that they want this information to be used by investors. So investors that are thinking of investing in projects, these Chinese projects, for instance, they are also worried or at least interested to understand what are the impacts or the likely projected impacts of this project. So it's for investors to also make financial decisions based on the information that will be disclosed. It's also for creditors. That is what they also mentioned in the guidelines, that this sustainability information will be useful, and the primary users would include investors, creditors, and even other business partners. So I think in a way we could potentially, if it's implemented, see BRI projects more or less either focusing on greener projects that are now being more alive to the impacts of the environment, or we might even also start to see projects that are maybe in renewable, um, you know, because I think there's also a lot of projects that are funded or that are under the BRI that are also in renewable. So we might also start to see that more and less the Chinese government is not approving projects that are in the so-called JT to renewable. I think that is the thinking that we also anticipate, and also that's what we are trying to understand. But we are still speculating at this stage, as you probably know, because the implementation aspect will be very different. But at least having the law in place, I think that's the first stage.
So, uh, Edwin, when you hear Obed talking, when you see all of that, when you
Mhm.
see all those guidelines and regulation, how Indonesia civil society organization can take advantage of those guidelines now to be able to engage with Chinese companies, so to obtain a much better or greener investment or greener engagement of those Chinese companies involved in Indonesia, especially when you talk about the lithium in Indonesia and how it's been polluting the environment, how Indonesia civil society organization and medias can take advantage of that.
Mm. Yeah. First, I want to start with this. It's been well established that developing countries, including Indonesia, they have very low enforcement of the regulations, environmental regulation. If not weak, they're very low. And this, and sorry, efforts and demands to increase, to improve the capacity of governments to enforce are huge, but to no avail so far. Capacity building, etc. So now we have this CSDS, this new regulations, not yet enforced, but this new regulation, if the new Chinese regulations gets enforced, especially this double materiality, in my understanding, it is requiring companies to report not only on how sustainability issue affects the financial performance, but also their environmental and social impacts. This is the key. So for Indonesian communities, this could lead to a greater corporate accountability. So greater corporate accountability means greater how do you call it, greater bar, which means their product will have a greater better quality in terms of market demands, because their products will meet market demands on environmental how do you call it, environmental regulations compliance. And when they have to how to call it, to meet the Chinese regulations requirements of their products on their environmental and social aspect, and also when they have to meet the Indonesian regulations requirements, then they will go on autopilot. if they want to sell, they will have to meet all of those requirements.
Exactly.
They will not be needing enforcement from the local governments because it will not be in their interest and they don't get it anyway. So these requirements will help them sell more, will help them produce more, will help their products to be accepted by the markets that has the various regulations, various requirements to enter their market. So I think it's good. Of course, we have to analyze clause by clause
Yeah.
later. Overall, I think it's good because producers will have to meet all requirements from the Chinese requirements, from the local country requirements. And it's good. They will go on autopilot.
Yeah.
If not, they cannot sell.
So, but do you see the same kind of impact from civil society organization? Do you think they're going to take advantage of it? Do they even know that that regulation has been released? And do you believe that they're going to take advantage of it to obtain much more greener and cleaner investment of Chinese in Zimbabwe?
Yeah. So first of all, you asked about the knowledge, whether people know that this basic ESG reporting requirement exists. I think most civil society have not really understood or even know that it exists, because we have not had civil society talk about this. I have not heard personally people trying to understand what this basic guideline mean for them and the work that they do around holding say Chinese corporates accountable. So my response is that most do not know. If they do, I think they're still grappling with how useful it would be for them, because when you have something like a law that is meant to say also have impact or at least extend overseas, one of the questions people would ask would be, how do I make use of that guideline if it were useful to hold a Chinese company, say, operating in Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC, for instance? So I think, and if you look at the guideline, there's very little information about how people can make use of it, in terms of say if a company is not complying, to reach out to the authorities, or if they've disclosed and they have a report which says something otherwise that is very different from what is occurring on the ground. There should be some way of following up, because some ESG laws, they have this requirement around stakeholder engagements. Of course, there is also that aspect, but the feedback mechanism to say, if a company has disclosed the impact of their project on the environment, on people, etc., um, how is it verified? How do a stock exchange sitting up there in Europe or in China, how does it know that indeed that is what's happening on the ground? That's what's prevailing. I think that is a missing piece to this guideline. And a lot of people, as you asked, the civil society particularly should also start to raise those questions and say, how do we make use of such a guideline if it were to be helpful for us? It almost seems at this stage the target users is mostly investors, creditors, people that are investing in this project. Those are the key target users that they're thinking could benefit or use those sustainability reports. That is my feeling at this stage.
You mentioned the case of lack of enforcement and lack of implementation. Looking from that perspective, we realize that we have a lot of complaints on the continent. I also believe in the global south, where the criticism are saying that if our laws and regulations are weak, we do expect China to be able to enforce those regulations back home. It means that China to sue companies that do have bad environmental impact on the environment in the operation overseas. But so far, when you look into the rules and to the guidelines, the way they call it, we don't see any kind of form of punishment that are kind of put out there or being dingled just to frighten those who the contravening, those who may not respect the law. So without those element of enforcement, without those sense of punishment, do you really expect or do you hope to see Chinese companies to start behaving differently, at least those who are behaving badly? Edwin, to you.
Indonesia has this mechanism when foreign investment does not comply uh, 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 local regulations, including environmental regulations. They have a set of I forgot, but they have a set of penalties
Okay.
up to canceling their permit.
Okay.
So they have to go home. So they have so Indonesia has this mechanism of each individual investment. If they I don't know how to call it, violates the regulations, the
Yeah.
rules, uh, in stages, how do you call it, in stages,
Yeah.
according to the severity. But the final one is to cancel their permit, so they have to go home.
Obed, on your side. Yeah.
So there's nothing in the guidelines that speaks explicitly about enforcement, such as things like
Okay.
penalties for non-compliance, or any kind of powerful regulatory authority that can then monitor and investigate whether companies are complying or not. But I want to make reference to two articles that they try to bring this element, but it's very implicit. It's not very explicit. So Article 30 of these guidelines,
Yeah.
they mandate that enterprises must, they must prepare a sustainability report and disclose it publicly on their website. Um, you know, and this
Okay.
implies that the minister, because the Minister of Finance, they are the issuing authority for this document. They have a regulatory oversight, but it doesn't specify the enforcement action if a company they fail to disclose that report on their website. Yeah. Then the second aspect is Article 27. It makes mention of a compliance statement by the company themselves. So once they've done their ESG report, they're completed. They have to, when they issue it out on the website, it should be accompanied by a compliance statement, just to say we are compliant.
Okay.
But again, it doesn't state how whether the Minister of Finance would be able to verify that compliance. So there's a lot of things that are still hanging that are not very clear. So the bottom line is that it doesn't create these explicit enforcement measures that we often see in some regulation.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, this is interesting. Can I
Go
can
ahead.
I
Go
add
ahead, Edwin.
something?
Yeah.
I think this is interesting. I don't think this will end up in sovereignty issues,
Okay.
because that's quite sensitive. I mean, some would see this as China enforcing their sovereignty and the regulation on other sovereign land.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is the issue. This is about the products. If you want the product, uh, be accepted by the market, if you want the product gets our stamp, say, you have to provide all this. And the interesting thing is that when the requirements are different, where there are discrepancy, for example, Indonesian regulation and Chinese regulation here,
Exactly. Yeah.
and so when for example, when a company violates or didn't comply to the Chinese regulations, but it it's not regulated in Indonesian regulations. It's not mandated. So Indonesian government doesn't have any problem because these Chinese companies only not complying to their own government's regulations. There will be fun. That will be kind of a quote unquote funny
Yeah.
situation. Yeah, I mean that will be interesting. But I don't think this issue will touch the sovereignty issues and nationalistic, etc. No, because I think this is about investment and products and all the methods that they have to go through to have the product ready.
Talking about investment and sovereignty just reminds me how China has been reluctant to implement those international norms overseas. Because what people don't understand is that China is still driven by its foreign policy principles of non-interference. So, from China perspective, enforcing its own law and regulation on operation overseas, where we do have an involvement of certain politicians or local lawmakers, it's like getting involved and interfering into internal politics business, which China doesn't want to do. That's why I'm kind of predicting those regulations to be much more harsh and to allow much more harsh punishment against Chinese operation in China. And I believe that China may become much more sensitive to those noise where they may start taking action against those companies that are violating the rules in the investment back home. But the fact that it came from the Minister of Finance is very telling for me. It's just telling that the Minister of Finance is just making sure that now sustainability has become one of our main conditions for you to receive loan and financing from me. From the bank, from the central bank, from any kind of policy bank, China Exim Bank, China Development Bank, and other big or commercial bank. Just telling them that you have to make sure, and Albert mentioned that before. It's within the framework of the smart and beautiful way. You have to make sure that we're going to give you money, not to make situation worse, not to reinforce pollution, not to make things difficult. We're gonna make we are only going to reward those who are going on the green side of the investment, of the green side of the environment, to make sure that the project is really have a low minimum risk and impact on the environment. I think we're gonna stop here, so I'm gonna give you the last word. I'm gonna start with you, Edwin. When you see that kind of piece of regulation guide, I'm gonna change the language, guidelines. When you see that kind of guidelines, and when we know that maybe by 2026 or 2027 it may become regulation, are you hopeful to see that tomorrow Chinese footprint investment in Indonesia could be greener and different than what we see today? And how do you see Indonesia adapting to that new regulation that may take place?
I'm hopeful but skeptical. I mean,
Okay.
if I haven't seen proof, then but I'm hopeful. This is a good step. If it's enforced, this is a good step because China step up their game. Because not only China having these regulations, American, the US, the Europeans, European Union, Scandinavian, they have all these regulations that regulates their own companies investing outside. They have to meet this and that, this and that. This is the same. It is a step up, and which I'm hopeful that it will lead to a better environment condition, social condition, ESG. But I'm skeptical, as in just like any other
Person
hope.
would be, yeah.
Yeah, of course, we have to be skeptical, but this is a good step forward. As long as that's what I'm hopeful.
Obert, you wrote the piece. You're in Zimbabwe. You've seen it all. You've seen the impact of Chinese investment. You've seen not only Chinese investment, the impact of those investment in general. You've heard the complaints of local communities. You've worked with civil society organization. You've seen how a bad mining operation can have as an impact on the on local communities. When you report about that, and when you report about that guidelines, and when you see what's happening, when you see the trajectory of Chinese companies are taking in the country, are you hopeful of what may become tomorrow, the future of Chinese investment in your country?
Yeah, in a way, I think I share the same sentiment with Edwin. I'm hopeful, but also, very skeptical about, yes,
Skeptical. Okay.
about whether this
Okay.
guideline becomes a regulation, whether it will be enforced. And because of the reasons you mentioned around lack of, clear mechanisms around enforcement, around sanctioning non-compliance. So that is, I think, the major reason why I'm hopeful. I think we have not seen such, a guideline coming from China, and also the extent that it is trying to address the value chain across, different products, and the fact that we have a number of Chinese companies operating not only in Zimbabwe but in Africa that are listed those stock exchanges, that are in the mining, say transport, energy, etc. So I think we could start to see those companies heeding to the call. So they might start to turn around their operations themselves without any civil society doing anything, because this is coming from their government, and they also get a lot of finance from Chinese financial state banks. Um, so that way, there is sort of like an incentive for them to start changing, because they are also businesses where international partners are investing, not only in China. So there's I think a lot of push that can help communities in Africa or in Zimbabwe or South America, etc. That if these companies listed that, so it's a good thing. And the fact that it's also coming from the finance side, the finance ministry, is also telling that they are not going to be pumping in money in projects that are to be
Exactly.
polluting, or that have negative impacts on the image, because they're also trying to protect the image of China and what they invest in. So I think that's why I'm hopeful. But those deficiencies that I mentioned in terms of lack of enforcement, and how people could make use of the guideline, if you have something that you'd want to raise, that, well, I've seen this report, this is what it says, but I disagree with what's in the report, because I'm on the ground
Yeah.
and what I observe is not what is contained in there.
Yeah. I personally, I do believe that these guidelines are going to evolve to become regulation. When we know how Chinese regulations are put in place, they usually start as a guidelines. They take small steps. It's kind of, they take a moment of 1 or 2 years or maybe 3 years just to see how the guidelines are adhered to. What are the feedback that they're receiving from different stakeholders? What are the holders into implementing those guidelines? What are the problems? So based on that, they learn on how we're gonna make it a regulation in terms of like what should be the enforcement procedure, what should be the the punishment, what should be all those kind of mechanisms to put in place to really make it a regulation. I believe by 2026 or 2027 we may see a different shape and different formats of those guidelines, and it may even switch from the Ministry of Finance to the Ministry of Environment to really become something, a staple of Chinese engagement in the global south, not only internally but also externally in the global south countries. So I'm really not hopeful, not skeptical, but I'm just observing how China is evolving, because China is being trying to do a lot of taking a lot of initiative to try to make to greener its footprint overseas. So we're gonna have to look into how it's moving, how things are changing, and how a Chinese company are evolving. So our interview is gonna stop here. Thank you guys for being here for this conversation, and thank you guys for watching us on YouTube. And I'm gonna see you hopefully next week for another video with another guest, or I'm gonna be here myself debriefing you with another news of China engagement in the global south. See you.